The Whispering Geometries, a case for private detective John Masterson. The autumn of 1928 brought with it more than the usual melancholy that settles upon the weathered cobblestones of old Providence. It was in those dying days of October that Mrs. Abigail Thornfield appeared at my office door, her countenance bearing the unmistakable pallor of one who has gazed too long into abyssal depths. "Mr. Masterson," she began, her voice trembling, like autumn leaves before a storm, "my husband has been changed, and I fear it has something to do with that accursed manuscript he discovered in the cellar of our newly inherited estate." Professor Erasmus Thornfield, as she explained, had been a respected mathematician at Miskatonic University until 3 weeks prior, when he ceased attending his lectures and began spending his days and nights hunched over yellowed pages covered in symbols that seemed to writhe when glimpsed peripherally. "The symbols," she whispered, producing a hastily sketched copy from her handbag, "they hurt to look upon directly." And Erasmus speaks of angles that shouldn't exist, of spaces between spaces where things dwell. I studied the crude reproduction she had made. Even rendered in graphite upon ordinary paper, the geometric configurations seemed wrong somehow, offensive to the eye and mind alike. Lines intersected at impossible angles, creating shapes that appeared to fold in upon themselves in ways that Euclidean geometry would forbid. My investigation began at the Thornfield estate, a colonial structure dating to the 1680s that squatted like a malevolent toad among the twisted oaks of Blackwood Hill. The professor greeted me at the door, though greeted seems inadequate to describe the hollow-eyed creature who had once been a man of learning. His hair had gone completely white, and his fingers bore strange burns, not from fire, but as if branded by geometries too complex for human flesh to comprehend. "The manuscript," he muttered, leading me to his study with jerky, marionette-like movements. It was hidden behind a false panel, written in the hand of one Obadiah Marsh, who vanished mysteriously in 1692. The formulae, oh, the beautiful, terrible formulae. The document lay spread across his desk like some obscene altar cloth. The parchment seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and the ink, if ink it was, held a depth that suggested it had been mixed with substances I dare not contemplate. The mathematical notations were interspersed with passages in what I recognized as bastardized Latin, punctuated by symbols that seemed to squirm and shift when observed directly. As Professor Thornfield began to read aloud, the very air in the room grew thick and oppressive. The angles of the chamber itself seemed to bend, walls meeting in corners that couldn't possibly exist in three-dimensional space. And from somewhere beyond the margins of reality came a sound, not quite music, not quite mathematics, but something that existed in the liminal space between calculation and cacophony. "The Whispering Geometries," Thornfield breathed, his eyes now completely vacant of human recognition. "They show us the true shape of existence, not the crude 3 dimensions we inhabit like insects crawling upon a sphere's surface, but the infinite dimensional reality that underlies all things. The angles, Masterson, the angles sing." It was then that I perceived the true horror of his condition. The professor was not merely reading the manuscript, he was becoming it. His body had begun to take on the impossible angles described in the text, bending in ways that should have shattered bone and torn flesh, yet maintaining a grotesque integrity that defied natural law. The room itself had become a non-Euclidean nightmare, its corners folding into dimensions that my mind refused to process. Through gaps in reality that gaped like wounds in the fabric of space-time, I glimpsed the whisperers themselves, entities of pure mathematics, beings composed of living equations that existed in the spaces between numbers. They had been waiting, these geometric horrors, for someone with sufficient mathematical knowledge to properly interpret Obadiah Marsh's formulae. The manuscript was not merely a record of blasphemous mathematics, it was a summoning circle inscribed in symbolic logic, a trap designed to snare minds capable of comprehending its true meaning. As Professor Thornfield's transformation reached its culmination, his body dissolving into a writhing mass of impossible angles and non-Euclidean curves, I seized the manuscript and cast it into the fireplace. The parchment screamed as it burned, a sound like the death cry of geometry itself, and reality snapped back into its proper configuration with an almost audible twang. The professor lay crumpled on the floor, his body mercifully returned to its human proportions, though his mind remained forever fractured by what he had witnessed. I gathered the ashes of the manuscript and scattered them in 7 different graveyards, ensuring that Obadiah Marsh's Devil's Mathematics could never again be reconstituted. Mrs. Thornfield committed her husband to the Danvers State Hospital, where he remains to this day, drawing impossible shapes in his own excrement and babbling of angles that bend backward through time. As for myself, I have developed a curious aversion to right angles and find myself taking only the most circuitous routes through the city streets, for I have seen the truth that lurks behind the facade of mathematical certainty, that our geometry is but a thin veneer covering an underlying reality of maddening complexity. And sometimes, in the dark hours before dawn, I still hear them whispering, the equations that exist beyond human comprehension, the formulae that spell out our doom in languages of pure number. The whispering geometries remember me as they remember all who have glimpsed their true forms. And I know that someday, when the angles align correctly and the mathematical constants shift into their true configuration, they will return to finish what Obadiah Marsh began so many centuries ago. From the Case Files of John Masterson, Private Detective, Providence, Rhode Island, 1928